Good evening, BookTube. You join me once again for yet another weekly update on my reading. I have a couple of books here to show you. The first one is Claire Tomalin's magnificent biography of Thomas Hardy, which I read recently and finished and thoroughly enjoyed. It is a fairly conventional, cradle to grave, full dress biography of one of the greatest writers in English literature. He is certainly a favorite writer of mine. In terms of Victorian writers, he is probably my second favorite after George Eliot, and I esteem him much more highly than I do Charles Dickens. Now, what Tomalin does in this book is, as well as giving you a straightforward narrative of Hardy's rather complicated life, she also dedicates a lot of time to talking about the works and to giving critical judgments of the works, which I actually rather appreciate, although I know that some people don't take kindly to that. I'm referencing in particular Brian at Bookish, who recently gave a review of Tomalin's Jane Austen biography, which he complained contained far too much in terms of critical analysis of the works of Dickens in a way that, I said he was reviewing her biography of Jane Austen. I meant to say her biography of Dickens. It's Joe Spivey who recently read her Jane Austen biography, so a slight mistake there, apologies. But he was talking about Tomalin's biography of Dickens, and he was complaining that Tomalin took too much of a dismissive approach to Dickens as a person and as a writer, and that he didn't like the non-chronological way in which he wrote about Dickens and his life and work. I didn't actually find that to be my experience in my reading of her biography of Hardy. Obviously, the life is talked about in more or less chronological order. There are, of course, gaps where she takes a break from talking about the life to talk about the works that he was writing at that particular time in his life. But broadly speaking, I would say that this book is written in what you would expect is a chronological order. So perhaps Brian at Bookish just has a very different idea of how a biography of a famous writer should go. I think it stands to reason that if you're reading a biography of a massive literary figure like Hardy or Dickens, you will have, as well as a discussion of the author's lives, a discussion of the author's life and a discussion of the literature that they produced. So I can't say I fully agree with his own philosophy of literary biographies, but each to his own. This is actually the second book on Hardy I have read, and it is the second book I've read on him this year. I read an earlier biography, well, I said earlier, it's actually a book that came out this year, so much later than this one, but it's a book I read earlier. Hardy Women by, what's her name again? Paula Byrne, in which she looks at his life through the lens of all the women who influenced him, or who he had any sort of passing acquaintance with. And it's a very interesting way of looking at the life of a man who was very much defined by his relationships with women. And Tomalin goes into some great detail here about his relationships with his two wives in particular, Emma and Florence Hardy. Now, she isn't quite as tantalizing or gossipy, perhaps, as Byrne is in her own account, but there is certainly plenty here that should inform, entertain, and amuse, hopefully, the reader. in terms of Hardy's personal life. I can't say that too much of what she says was new to me, because I already knew a lot about Hardy's life just from watching documentaries and also from reading a great many Thomas Hardy books, with Tess of the D'Urbervilles probably being my favourite, although it is in a close competition with The Mayor of Casterbridge, which I absolutely adore. And Hardy, for those of you who are familiar with his works, has also inspired quite the crop of television adaptations of his works, especially of Tess of the D'Urbervilles and Far from the Madding Crowd, but also The Mayor of Casterbridge and Jude the Obscure have also inspired similar productions. So I can't recommend enough that you go and read Thomas Hardy and read this very good biography of Thomas Hardy by Claire Tomalin. I must say that her analysis of the poetry is every bit as good as her analysis of the books, and actually had me wanting to go away and read the poems in question whenever they were being discussed in this book. So that's certainly a strength of this book. Any literary biography that makes you want to go and read the author can only be a good thing. So that is Claire Tomalin's biography of Thomas Hardy. I know she's written many other biographies. I'm certainly keen, having read this one, to read her other ones, the more negative reviews from other people notwithstanding. Just a heads up, if you're looking for some really scintillating prose, this probably is not where you'll find it. Claire Tomalin is a good writer, but she is nothing spectacular, I would say. She's fairly run-of-the-mill and workmanlike in her approach, which didn't stop me from enjoying her work. So that is Claire Tomalin's Thomas Hardy biography. This is Reformation, Europe's House Divided, by probably the premier historian of Christianity in modern times. That is Dermot McCulloch, whose magisterial, I want to say definitive, although no history of Christianity can really be definitive, but I would say quasi-definitive book on Christianity, the first 3,000 years. Just a marvelous, engaging romp through the history of this fascinating religion. And this is an earlier book he wrote some years before that, in which he talks about the Reformation, that seismic split in Western Christianity, from which it has never fully recovered. It has never really regained the unity and the strength of purpose, perhaps, and the monolithic nature that it enjoyed prior to the Reformation. And this is an account of that devastating split right through the middle of Christianity from 1490 to 1700. We have a whole series of players here, many of whom are placed on the front of the book. We have Martin Luther, we have Henry VIII. I'm not too sure who that is, to be quite honest with you. That's Catherine de' Medici. It says it here. Catherine de' Medici. We have one of the popes, Pope Paul III. I think that's Zwingli, Huldrych Zwingli, one of the leaders of the Reformation. But this is every bit as well researched and every bit as informative as his brilliant book on Christianity, the first 3,000 years. There isn't quite as much of his dry wit, I would say, as there is in his book on the first 3,000 years of the Christian faith. But it is nevertheless a very well-written book. You really get the impression that he has dug deep into every conceivable primary source associated with the Reformation. He goes through the whole history, all the way from its beginnings in Germany through to the spread of this new religion across the whole of Europe, from Germany to the furthest reaches, all the way from, let's say, Poland in the east, all the way to Britain in the north, and even further afield, all the way to the New World. I'm almost halfway through this. I'm still reading it, and I am still really enjoying it, and I'm finding out all sorts of things that I didn't know before. All sorts of eye-opening facts. That's the wonderful thing when it comes to a massive brick of a history book like this. There is no shortage of facts to amuse and to even shock you. And one of the facts which I learned recently from reading this is that it took until 1801, I believe, for a translation in Gaelic of the Bible to come out for the people of Scotland to read. Prior to that, the work of evangelism was done largely through word of mouth. And what happened was that the Protestants in Scotland, the reformers in that country, would train up local people who spoke Gaelic, and they would go into the rural areas and they would proselytize. And that was how Scotland was won to the cause of Protestantism, which was very interesting to read about. But to not have a Gaelic translation, a Scottish Gaelic translation of the Bible, until that late in the game was something that was quite eye-opening to me. I've also been reading a lot about how the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth might have been the hotbed of a Protestant revival if things had gone slightly different in history. Of course, we think now of Poland as being this hotbed of Catholicism, but back in the time of the Reformation, Poland-Lithuania, with its openness and with its liberalism, was the home to a very vibrant Protestant community. So that was really interesting to read about. Another thing that he goes into a lot of detail about is the split between the Lutherans and the Calvinists, the bitter struggle between, on the one hand, Luther's perhaps more conservative interpretation of Protestantism and the more radical Reformed version pioneered by people such as Calvin and Theodore Beza and other such people. And of course, one major bone of contention, I should say, for those of you who are in the know about this, was the Eucharist and the question of whether or not the blood and body of Jesus was in fact actually present during this ceremony that is of such great importance to so many people who call themselves Christians. And for those of you who aren't Christian, and I count myself as being one of them, this will all seem to you like so many angels dancing on the head of a pin. It does seem absurd to those of you who may not share the bitter, passionate beliefs that these men did hold. I happen to think that the Reformation was an unfortunate event in the history of Christendom and of Europe more generally. I think it unleashed a new era of violent religious intolerance and fanaticism. I think it destroyed the work of people like Erasmus that could have brought about a more tolerant, a more liberal, a more human form of Christianity than what later emerged, which was, unfortunately, a hardening on both sides of the divide, a new Puritanism, a new moral Puritanism that I think calcified Europe, calcified the European spirit, brought about a new kind of oppression and repression, and was greatly damaging, actually, to the fabric of European society and of European unity, which of course only laid the foundation for so much of the turmoil that emerged in later centuries. So that is Dermot McCulloch's Reformation, which I am still reading. I probably won't get to the Napoleon biography, which I wanted to read for Nonfiction November, but those are my two recent reads for Nonfiction November, and I hope you enjoyed hearing me talk about them. I should also mention that I have a new webcam, which I am trying out, so if you notice that the sound quality or picture quality is different from what you have come to expect from this channel, that is why. So I hope that it is working well and that it is doing its job. There is a reason why I spent so much money in order to acquire it, and please do let me know in the comments if it is in fact doing its job. I'm going to end the video here. Please feel free to leave, as always, your comments and your contributions in the comment section below. Bye for now, BookTube.